Welcome to One Word Stories. My name is Joanna Zell, and I'm really happy to greet a very special guest of mine today, Joe Lambert. A very warm welcome, Joe.
Well, it's great. It's great to talk to you. You know, it's been a long time since we were in Hamburg at the same time, and we have such fond memories of the Beyond Storytelling Conference.
Definitely.
The work that was being done there and the kind of conversations they're they're rare to be in a group of people, with so much integrity and so much interest, so much passion about story and about the role it plays in our lives, in our work. And hopefully I'll get back to one of those conferences or some gathering. That the hope for all of us is that we're on the other side of the worst of the COVID story.
Exactly.
And we'll begin to be able to gather again and see each other across these great.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward. I'm really very much looking forward to seeing you again, Joe, because your presence in Hamburg was very special, and I tremendously enjoyed also your keynote. It wasn't really the keynote speech, it was kind of a workshop even for a crowd of 100 plus people, so it was amazing. And Joe is actually the founder of the Center for Digital Storytelling, pioneering in this field. You are also an author of several books regarding digital storytelling, and you've been working with the digital storytelling approach for decades right now. And when I think of, the process, you yourself say that the digital storytelling is a process where our ordinary stories become extraordinary journeys. How does it happen?
Any of us that sit at a dinner table with a group of relatively new friends fall into story naturally. And usually at some point, there's a word called trust, and people feel trust appears in the group, and somebody will talk about something slightly more difficult, slightly more intimate, slightly more at the heart of their current emotional state, something that's bothering them, something they're holding. And at that moment, we lean into our humanity, right? We don't go, oh, don't talk about that. I mean, maybe there are, those are not very happy dinner parties, but generally people lean in, and they lean in to hear what's said. And that leaning in allows the storyteller, the person that's suddenly going, I really need to share this because it's hard for me to be present because this is on my mind. That leaning in allows them to unpack that through speaking the words of the experience or the process of thinking about the experience, the reflection. And that unloading, the word, it's a weight and it's being released, and it's suddenly you're a little lighter, you're a little bit less burdened by the emotional energy that some aspect of your life process you're carrying. And because we all do that naturally, and we do it obviously easier if we're with groups of people that we know kind of share our world or share our language or share aspects of our culture, it's a little bit easier when there's some cultural connection, gender connection, class connection. There are all these things that it makes it easier for us to trust. But it happens no matter what. If a group of people choose to be in the room and choose to say, I'm here to share stories. And so I think what's worked in our work is that, people come with intention. Once in a while they're surprised. They're in a classroom and the teacher says, guess what? We're going to tell digital stories. My guess is that works less successfully than when people self-select into a process. And they share a story with a kind of meaning for them that's, I'm here to do the work. And again, we could say, is it like a therapeutic encounter? Like you go to a group therapy around recovery or around, it's like that. But I think the artifact making process, whether it's a written script a recording of your voice or the little movies we make in our workshops. The artifact is what turns it into something a little bit more, tangible
Yeah.
for the person. It's one thing to talk it out, and that itself is powerful. It's another thing to kind of write it, which has a different power. It's like, what am I really trying to say? How do I get a considered way of saying all this in an efficient way? That causes a bunch of work to be done. And then once you're playing with your voice in your ears again and again, and watching pictures that are your pictures, or about something about, and you're doing it again and again, and then finally you project this thing on the wall in front of a small group of people, we've seen it can be very transformational for many people. And not everybody, of course, none of this is a panacea. This is just part of the work of creative engagement in our lives that helps us kind of move through. And you can be a painter or a sculptor or a musician or a dancer, or all those things. People do it in part because it releases some of that pent up emotional energy, and we're back in our bodies and we're feeling better. And so I don't think the thing we do, I think there's a little bit of mystery in editing video as a kind of psychological process using your own material. That mystery is something we're still, making sense of. But I don't think there would be an international movement of digital storytelling if people were like, this is different, this is special, and I want to do more of it. When I started, it was hard to get people to show up at any workshop because it was just weird. It's like, you want us to do what?
Yeah.
And I've been very lucky for the last 20 years that I make a living mainly doing this. I don't have to do other things. In the 90s when we started, I still had to do a lot of other things to make a living, and I barely made a living then. But it finally became the job I have is training other people, and now I have a big staff.
Yeah. So actually, what people can imagine is that they come to your event, your workshop, and they think of a story that is challenging for them. And there must be a struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no story. And then, as you have said, it's not only about writing a scenario. Yeah, it's just a tiny part, writing down a couple of the, let's say, keywords, and then mainly searching for some visuals, for audio, for music, and through this creative process, approaching the core of the story, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, there are many different types of workshops. About 20% of our work are in public workshops that anybody in the world can take, especially during, the online move of all of our work during the pandemic. People that come to that can tell whatever story they want. And they probably have a little bit of intention, but sometimes they're not sure.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of like, well, listening to what other kinds of stories that are being told. We'll show examples. We give a little lecture at the beginning saying, here's what we think about storytelling. Here's 2 or 3 things that were made exactly in the same workshop. We're not showing you a movie or a short film, or we're saying a person like you came here and did this, and we think this is a way to frame understanding of it, to deconstruct the why of it as well as the what of it. What's the form. And when people go into the next part of every workshop is the circle of listening, is the story circle, then they usually kind of go, oh, I get it. And then they get a little deeper into it because people are going, wow, that's such a great story. What about this? What about that? And then they move forward. In the way we teach and train people is like, the story circle is to open people up. I always say like an egg. It's like crack you open. Suddenly your mind is a little bit freer. You're a little bit less like, oh, this is going to be terrible. Most people think their creative efforts are bad, ineffective, amateurish, and they don't feel very good about creativity. So once they're open, then they're like, yeah, this won't be so bad. Then they write stuff, and then we do processes of iterative feedback so that they like what they're doing more and more. And then, of course, as they're writing, we're saying, what are you seeing? Since it's a visual form, what are you seeing? And sometimes they're writing into a picture, right? I have this picture and I'm going to tell a story about this picture, which makes a great digital story. Or they're going, yeah, I don't have pictures of that, but I think the metaphor for this is this. And so we work together to kind of create the visual treatment. And even in the writing, sometimes side by side, like a storyboard, or other times is like they do the recording and then we say, okay, now let's go figure out the edit. We teach them how to edit video, right? I mean, that's a kind of literacy, right? Media literacy, by doing it, not by just talking about it, but by making it, right?
Yeah. Learning by doing. This is actually what you are also applying in different groups. So of course, it's always about an individual story. Nevertheless, you work with youth, you work with indigenous people. And when I listened to your description, I have been thinking of using the digital storytelling also right now in this times of uncertainty, conflicts, war around the corner.
Where I said is a lot of people come to our open workshops with a kind of freedom of expression. They can tell any story they want. Many people came to us because there's an intent in our work. We are a social justice organization. We are part of the history of people fighting for democracy at every level of culture, trying to undo histories of colonizing power or gender power or this and that power, agency that comes from the inside. And the person says, of course I have a voice, and of course my vote counts and my voice counts. And I, in a sense, the intent of that work means a lot of people come to workshops where they're saying, I'm here to tell a story that nobody is telling, and it needs to be heard, not just for me, but all the people like me, all the people, last night I had a person in a workshop tell a story about the murder of her brother. When she was 18, he was murdered in the city she lived in. And you hear her tell it and almost like, but I don't know what this story is for. And it was like, one, it's amazing you now have the emotional strength to tell about a horror, really, a horrible day, a nightmarish experience. You now have the energy to do it. It doesn't cause you to grieve actively, to weep. Well, of course, there are other people who've suffered horrors that are so painful, they're hard to talk about. They're hard to, and there's a whole range of traumatic experience. That word in English now is used a lot, trauma. It's just a shock to the system in which revisiting the shock reshocks the system, right? We know this from psychology. And people need to be ready to do it, and they have to do work to be ready to talk about it. But when they do, everybody, as I said before, they lean in a lot, right? We lean in with our hearts, trying to hold the story of the person, trying to imagine what it was like, and trying to, say, how the hell do we keep things like that happen? Immediately, the discussion was about drug rehabilitation work. Of course, this woman's gone on to work in criminal justice and, areas of helping people, because she said 2 people died that day, her brother and the person that killed her, because their life was over as they knew it. They were soon arrested, incarcerated, and the rest of their life was going to be told by that story as well. Obviously that's extremely generous to hold both those stories. And she wants, we'd all like to stop that thing. We'd like to stop the fact that her brother, a perfectly lovely human, fell into drug use as a health problem and ended up dead in a criminal act, right? It's something that all of us know, that if those stories are out there, we stop time to listen, and then we change our mind. It's why at federal hearings or regional hearings, when you want to change a law, get somebody who's ready to tell the truth. In our culture, it's like around gun violence and violence, but in every culture, it's the truth and reconciliation of the Holocaust. It's the truth and reconciliation of the apartheid movement. It's the truth and a post-war things. You got to get the stories out in order for anything to move forward. Yesterday, I'm enough of a literate person that I know, Yevgeny Yevtushenko's poem over Babi Yar, right? It's about this horrendous genocidal act that happened right outside of Kiev, in which hundreds of people were murdered and buried in a mass grave. And in the 60s, during the beginning of our early 70s, right, Evgeny wrote that poem as a national, witnessing, remembering, holding space. And they built the memorial almost out of that poem. In every culture, when more stories are available, the healthier the structure is. It's not really about who runs the culture. It's about how those spaces are made. Indigenous people, you mentioned that, and I know you're interested in that, had many different traditions of power. And there were warrior clans, and there were more peaceable clans that were more agricultural. There were clans that were, matriarchal in power. But in many of the cultures, one of the things there was the talking stick, the circle of deliberation, in which if there was an important decision, everybody gets a shot at saying what they think should happen. And it was so inculcated in many of these cultures that people naturally still have this sort of thing as, I'm not going to say what I have to say until I'm moved to tell the story that needs to be told, or to have this opinion, or to express myself.
Currently, there are communities that are very, very divided in the families or among friends. And there is this division. So when I think of it, exactly the same division in the United States because of political reasons, exactly the same division in my country of origin, in Poland, where people are right now very united, helping the Ukraine. However, still a couple of weeks ago, also in this division, because of different worlds they seem to belong to or want to.
Well, yeah, I mean,
part of.
again,
So,
we could say
with
they
this,
belong to different narratives.
Exactly. Yeah. So with this, working with stories is, of course, offering the space for the stories of conflict.
Yeah, there are many processes in the United States that are about dialogue and deliberation, and many times these are processes that people in communities where there is this great tension of difference, and it might be along these kind of more well-known big ideological divides, but sometimes it's just, somebody's an environmentalist and somebody wants to make money out of the timber industry, and you need those people to talk to each other, and maybe they can find new ways of thinking about it. And in the United States and Canada, places where there's a lot of timber work, there's been more land conservation connectedness between, the industries and the environmentalists, for example. We've done some of that work, and we certainly know many of the story workers over time have gone to do that work in places like Palestine and Israel, in places like Northern Ireland, in places where the conflicts have been there. In some ways, even the work in the former Eastern Bloc that we've done, those processes of exchange and story and truth and reconciliation are part of our work. It's not as formal as I would like it to be. We've looked at some of the organizations in the United States who are dedicated to the, we use the colors now, the red for the Republican Party, blue for the Democratic Party, but to having people from those affiliations sit with each other and talk. We tried to figure out some storytelling things. Let's go back to that special word that I used right at the beginning, this trust, right? The problem with the increased polarization of our culture is that we'll learn to not trust the other.
Yeah.
There's a tragedy or something, people get together, and we're seeing this in Europe, and the Eastern Europeans are going to, well, no, you don't get the old Soviet Eastern Bloc either. It's done. Get over it. We know that stories of communal purpose are what's needed to overcome this, but it almost has to be now without ideology. I think that's what we learned from the 20th century.
Yeah,
You can't,
definitely.
it has to be humanistic, which means I get you have a story and I respect it.
Yeah,
It's probably what your parents thought. It's
yeah,
certainly what a lot of your friends think. And that's why it's your story.
yeah.
But I'm going to respect that story as
Mm,
long as you promise not to harm people.
yeah, yeah.
and
Mm,
and it's not about ideology in the sense that I'm right and you're wrong. It's
mm,
we both have stories, and if we're
yeah,
self-aware about
and
those stories
different
and where they come from, we'll be a little bit less,
perspectives.
you
Mm,
know,
yeah,
sure of ourselves, self-righteous, right?
yeah,
Sure of our
yeah.
perspective.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, you have mentioned also how we can also work at this collective level, and also, as you have just said, it's not about being right or wrong. It's just a completely insane approach, yeah, because it's really about just showing the other perspective. And this is also something that is very, very intense right now among different people, because of course we are telling our own stories, our own experiences, how we feel about things that are going on, what we have heard maybe from our parents, grandparents, and so on and so forth. And you know, there is still something else. These untold stories. So the emotions we have inherited. And when you relate it also to the Shoah and to the indigenous people, and also, you know, the past of the Ukraine and the Soviet Union, these are these huge narratives that also impact our emotional state at the moment. So it's on the top.
Yeah, I mean, another metaphor I like is that every place has the ghosts of its past.
Yeah.
Every place has the ghosts of its past. And, people that layer down, like a kind of
Mm,
emotional archaeology go, "Well, I wonder why this place feels strange or powerful," or
mm,
it's like, well, there's stories there. Do you know the stories? And a part of, I know in our culture, like I'm living here in New Mexico, there's a lot of listening to indigenous narratives. And tonight I'm going to go hear the fantastic she was our poet laureate, Joy Harjo, who comes from this world and from Oklahoma, native uh, background. But, we listen to them with a great intent to understand where we are. Where am I?
mm,
What is the name of this place? In Tiwa, what is the name of Santa Fe? Not in Spanish. In
mm,
Tiwa, what is the name? What is the name of that river? What is the name of that mountain? We listen now because we know those words are there too, even though we don't know them. They are there. They are telling this place and informing the people who live here for, whatever thousands of years. They're informing what this place is. And
mm.
the more we know, the more we feel settled. Like, okay, I'll take better care of this place. I do care that it's cared for, that it's, maintained. So I think a lot of places, when the stories are covered up, like literally
Yeah.
buried in the earth, but buried certainly in the cultural psychology and the mass psychology. Now we're not talking about that anymore. Those things are there. If you don't then create the structures to tell the truth about what happened, it'll come back in, right?
Exactly.
So,
These untold
and
stories find the voice.
it's not an accident that Putin closed the major research nonprofit that was looking at Soviet era atrocities. He
Mm,
said, first thing, we're going to not stop talking about the past because that makes people feel bad. And the same thing here in the United States is the Republicans are saying, well, you can't teach critical race theory. I mean, which is a very specific little thing. And what they're really saying is, you can't make us feel bad about what our grandparents did to other people,
mm,
uh, or what we frankly are still doing to those same people. But you
mm.
can't teach that because it makes us feel bad. And literally in some of the legislation, it's like, this makes our children feel bad about themselves. We can't have that. What? No, the story's there. And if the child doesn't know that this terrible thing has happened, they're completely capable of doing it again. This is the moment we're in. We're in a moment we can't quite escape what we know from history, and story matters a lot in all of this.
And this is something that comes to my head, that, stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, stories we tell ourselves about the surrounding and about other people. These are also the stories that are going to impact our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Yeah? So this is also something very, very important, especially right now, how we deal with fear, how we deal with uncertainty, anxiety, how we are able to focus on something different than watching news, reading news, talking about this, what's going on. And actually, it's something that guides me to the next question. In the tough times, the times of pandemics right now, the times of the conflict that is escalating from day to day, what is such a word that actually was helpful for you, and what is the story behind it?
Breath, right? When you were talking, I thought, well, it's not a coincidence that the mindfulness movement in many cultures, borrowing from whatever wisdom tradition, Buddhism or other traditions, where you breathe. And several times this week, I with my classes, I said, let's do a square breathing, where you count to 4, breathe in, hold for 4, count to 4, breathe out, hold for 4. Because in some ways, there are processes that words can't. They can't. And so we need to hold the sense that excitation is making us fear, right? We're seeing trauma. We're aware that trauma could be on our bodies. We imagine that trauma on our bodies, and that makes us really uncomfortable. But the mindfulness tradition that's a thought. It's a cloud in your head. And thoughts aren't real. I'm safe right now, quite frankly, despite all my energy of the war and the history, and I think the story and it's really big. But right now, talking to you, I'm safe. And I can remember that when I breathe in and when I breathe out. And the story, it makes me think of the story of Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed away, the wonderful Vietnamese Buddhist, who taught all of us, many people of your and my generation, in a certain modernity of the Western capitalism. But he also taught a lot of people in the great Buddhist worlds of millions and millions of people that do these practices, that simple act of becoming is what gets us through moments like this. It causes us to calm down, and then we're not reactive in the same way. I think our practice of listening is also a practice of mindfulness, of presence. I mean, we're getting people to tell stories because we're being settled and we're listening fully. Doesn't happen much. People don't do that to each other, where you can be with your partner for 10 years and you'll get 2 or 3 occasions where they're really listening to you. It's amazing how that, just people listening to each other with great intent, even in Zoom, causes people to feel safety, to feel comfort, to feel support. And that makes a difference. It helps us, get up the next day and do what we got to do. So I would hope that that's with any of our friends. They're taking deep breaths, they're counting to 10 before they react to the news of the day. If they're scrolling, I'm mainly making space for this healing that people need to have as they've gone through these experiences of trying to change the world or resist or do whatever it is. I'm making space for them to talk about it and kind of process it. The difference making is super complicated in any one person's life, much less a collection of lives. Change happens, and it happens for a lot of complex reasons. So does our work change things? No, I think we work in the spirit of all of these mechanisms of change that we hope are healthy and sustainable.
Yeah.
and get us get the human race someplace a little bit further into a future that looks promising as opposed to darker. So
Joe, thank you very, very much for all your incredible stories, how you actually help heal the wounds in different individuals, in different groups, how you work with digital storytelling, and how you actually focus in this tough times on this essential human activity, which is just breathing and listening to others without trying to comment immediately, without trying to judge, without trying to respond immediately, but just to listen for understanding at the emotional level. This is actually something all of us, we need much, much more right now.
Yeah.
Thank
And it's
you.
a practice. It takes work. And
Yeah.
it takes work. So I'm glad I get to practice almost every day. Again, I thank you for all the work you're doing in collecting stories about storytellers. And I think, this effort of, the word, mine's today is breath. I don't know. I forget what mine was before.
I
But
love it.
yeah, it's, I think that is a useful way for us to look at it. I mean, I'll finish with this wonderful thing. It's outside my door. I live in a co-housing community.
Yeah.
And Sunday we put up what we call the poetry.
I saw it on
P-O-E-T-R.
Facebook. I love the
Yes.
idea.
And so, outside we just have a blank wall where people can, and every other day we take a picture of whatever's been written, and then we clear it off. So the next poem, the next series of words. And I think that's a sort of metaphor for what your work is, right? It's giving people a space to take a few words or take, to kind of, what can I make that makes sense of this feeling I have? And it doesn't take many words to do that.